All right, hello everybody. Um, I'm Mark Lipovetsky, and I'm very happy to open the spring 2021 session of the Russian Film Club at Columbia and the Harriman Institute. Um, as some of you may know, we are running this film club for the second year now, but of course, due to the pandemic, we have changed the format and having it as panels, discussion panels about films that you can watch outside of this session. They're available, and you can find the links to them at the Harriman Institute's webpage. Uh, and our program for this semester will include debates about such films as, for example, "Дорогие товарищи" by Andron Konchalovsky, and the TV series based of "Мертвые души" by Grigory Konstantinopolsky. We will also have most exciting discussion about fembots and different keyboards in Russian TV and film. And today's discussion is from this neighborhood as well, but this will be introduced by my co-host and fellow, and also the postdoctoral fellow at the Harriman Institute, and the professional film scholar, Daria Ezerova, whom I'm passing the baton.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yes, so we're very much picking up where we left off. Last semester. As some of you may remember, we moved on to talking about genre films, and our last discussion in the fall was on Galim Shipenko's text. So we are continuing today with another genre film, but of a very distinct genre, very uncommon genre, although I'm hoping that there will be more examples going onwards, on the film Sputnik by Egor Abramenko, who Mark and I identified as a sci-fi horror, but by all means, we're looking forward to be contested during this conversation and maybe during the Q&A too. Usually in my film introductions, I try to not give any spoilers nor too much information before we actually go to the discussion. So I've limited my introduction today to 3/4 facts about this film. And the first one, I have to say it because I cannot, I'm human like everybody else. I cannot stop laughing at the fact that a film about an alien parasite living inside a human being has the same name as the Russian COVID vaccine. So now I can go into the proper introduction mode. Thank you for letting me do this. The film that we're going to be discussing today actually started off as a short film, a collaboration between Egor Abramenko and Roman Volobuev. The short was called Passenger. It premiered as part of the short film program at the Kinotavr Film Festival in 2017. And received sort of moderately positive reviews. So we should really think about Sputnik as something that Egor Abramenko was thinking over and planning over the past 3 years. The second thing that I wanted to say is that many reviews of the film and Mark and mine conversation in preparation for this event mentioned DAO. So the project DAO, the Khrushchevsky's infamous project that we discussed last semester. So I wonder to what extent we can actually talk about the ghost of DAO or the DAO haunting in this film and this idea of a secret research institute. And the fact that DAO is slowly becoming kind of the Russian uncanny at this point, kind of informing contemporary Russian cinema that you can pretty much no longer talk about any new films without mentioning DAO. And finally, something that very recently occurred to me was the question of realism and historical accuracy to the extent that it applies to Sputnik. And why I thought of that, I read a review in one of the Russian sources. It was overwhelmingly a positive review. However, it did dedicate kind of an inordinate amount of time talking about how the setting is not necessarily historically accurate. And my favorite part about that review was that someone actually said, this is some kind of Soviet Uniqlo. Why are they all dressed like that? Why such stylish, kind of clean-cut silhouettes? And why are the uniforms so nice on Bondarchuk, etc.? And while this review that I read was positive, a lot of other views on Sputnik in the Russian sources were critical for insufficient historical accuracy. So that sort of made me think about why realism has become so important in contemporary Russian cinema. And why chastise kind of a filmmaker who, being a millennial, probably doesn't really remember the Soviet Union and is very much going towards this kind of atmospheric, impressionistic vision of the Soviet Union for not being entirely historically accurate. So I'm going to stop here and move on to introducing our speakers today. And our first speaker is Eliot Borenstein, who is a professor of Russian and Slavic Studies and senior academic convener for the Global Network at New York University. He's the author of Men Without Women, Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction that won the 2001 Edsel Book Prize. He's also the author of Overkill, Sex and Violence in Contemporary Russian Popular Culture, who won another prize, 2008 AWSS Book Prize, and Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism. I'm not going to name prizes anymore.
No, who won another prize, right? Just right now.
And Pussy Riot Speaking Punk to Power, which probably will also win prize because, you know. His current projects include 3 recently submitted book manuscripts: Soviet Self-Hatred, The Secret Identities of Post-Socialism, Marvel Comics in the 1970s, The World Inside Your Head, and Meanwhile in Russia, Russian Internet Memes and Viral Video. And he has recently begun work on HBO's The Leftovers, Mourning and Melancholy and Premium Cable, and Unstuck in Time on the Post-Soviet Uncanny. Mark?
So if Eliot is the top-notch expert in all monsters, Julia Vaingurt, our next participant, is the top-notch expert in technology and posthumanism. She is an associate professor of Russian studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. She is the author of Wonderlands of the Avant-Garde Technology and the Arts in Russia in the 1920s, and a co-editor of the first volume on posthumanism in Russian culture, The Human Reimagined, Posthumanism in Russia. And just recently, I would say weeks ago, a newest volume edited by Julia has been announced. It's called «Нестандарт. Забытые эксперименты в советской культуре, 1934-1964». And I'm very happy that I'm one of contributors to this collection as well. And it has been published, or will be published, I don't know, the timeline here, by the NLO Publishing House in Moscow as we speak. And she is currently working on a book that explores the poetics of weakness in late Soviet culture.
And our third speaker today is another foremost expert on posthumanism, is Tomi Haxhi, who is a 5th-year PhD student in Russian literature at Columbia University. His dissertation focuses on Soviet and post-Soviet speculative fiction from the Revolution to the Putin era, specifically on discourses of posthumanism as a means of working through national trauma and reckoning with historical breaks. Most recently, Tomi presented at ACES in 2020 on posthumanism and exceptionalism in the Strugatsky's Noon Universe works. Mark?
Yes. Before we start the discussion, I would like to suggest all our participants to speak very briefly, to make some kind of opening statement. So what do you think about this film, whether you find it interesting or not, and why, right? And then we'll explore the details. So you shouldn't be so rather you should stay within 5 minutes or less for this opening statement, because we have more time to look into this. So shall we proceed in the order that we introduced, if you don't mind? So then, Eliot, you are first.
Great, and thank you for the introduction. This is a great event, and it got me to watch this film, which frankly I probably wouldn't have watched this quickly or this many times without this particular event happening. So wonderful. Wonderful is not a word I use to describe this film. The word I use to describe this film is it's fine. It was okay. It was high quality, professional, looks good, sounds good. There's no shame in this film, but I didn't find it particularly wonderful. But what I did find is several points that strike me as particularly interesting about it. It's fascinating to hear this question of realism raised in relation to a movie about an alien predator inside the body of a cosmonaut, but fine. But it also is a suggestion of priorities, because the thing that took me out of the film immediately was that this alien creature can somehow live in a hard vacuum, but once it's on Earth, can't live outside the body of this cosmonaut. So the pseudoscience part of this was not well thought out at all. Granted, aliens, the life cycle of the xenomorphs and the aliens is also a bit confusing, but this was just sort of tossed out there. I think that the setting of the research institute here struck me as a way in which, even though this film is obviously cribbing from Alien, it's actually more in the tradition of The Thing, and the whole set of, so if Alien's a haunted house in space, these other types of movies are about the monster in isolation and how you can't get away from it because you're too far from everything else. So the setting works for that, and perhaps the entire USSR works for that. Otherwise, there are three themes that I thought were particularly, four themes that I thought were particularly useful that we can look at as we discuss. One is this interior-exterior thing, inside-outside mind-body problem that is obvious there from being out in space and spam in the can and also having this alien inside you. The other is, like in the Alien films, reproduction and male reproduction, though here it's there's a fascinating twist on it in that it ends up being as much about adoption as it is about reproduction. So that's kind of fascinating. Voluntarism, the idea that the triumph of the individual will here, basically. Tanya is able to withstand things because she always has, and because she can conquer her fear, which leads to what I think is the my biggest objection to the film, which is how you can read it very easily as a film about disability, and it does a terrible job with that. The revelation about her past and how the triumph of her own will going that helps her overcome her disability, the fact that basically her techniques with this alien are kind of like techniques for dealing with special needs children, like when she does lie down next and mirror the kid. That's classic technique, but I think it's very telling that the thing that's got her so much in trouble is that in treating this teenager, she nearly drowns him because that's what she needs to do. In that way, perhaps historically accurate, she's an example of a really, really terrible approach to dealing with people with differences, and there's nothing more different than someone with an alien in their body. So as a disability text, it's really terrible. But otherwise, lots of fun.
All right, maybe next we can switch
to
Julia. Would you like to speak next?
Julia, please turn on your mic, and don't turn it off at all.
No. Okay, so I agree with Eliot. I actually also found the most problematic part is the part at the end where we understand that Tanya has overcome her disability and also simultaneously has transformed herself from genderless creature into a woman. And I thought that was the most problematic part of the film, and I would like to discuss it further later on. But I also found the film interesting. I thought that perhaps the most interesting part of it for me was the fact that it was a kind of Soviet Uniqlo, and that the film was in some way precisely like the symbiosis of the host or of the human and the creature, to me, was a kind of a metaphor for the symbiosis between two cultures, right? So the Soviet culture or Russian culture and American culture. And so this kind of symbiosis is what I thought was the most interesting part of the film, in fact, right? That in some ways, the filmmakers are admitting the fact that disentanglement is impossible, right? So this is, and it's both on the level of form and on the level of content, right? On the cinematic content. So that was, to me, the most interesting part. And the second most interesting part was a kind of attempt to discuss biopolitical questions and specifically potentially offering a new alternative vision of good biopolitics versus bad biopolitics, that is Semiradov's biopolitics, right? I'm wondering to what extent we can read Klimova's approaches, whatever misguided they could be, as an attempt to create some kind of alternative to Semiradov's bad biopolitical regime. But that is also another thing that I would like to talk later on. So yeah, that's about it for now.
Thank you, Julia. Tomi, it's your turn.
So in preparation for today's talk, I actually went back and rewatched the Alien film because everybody seemed to mention it. Seems to be impossible not to mention in relation to this film. And I also watched the second and the third. And I have to say, obviously there's the very potent image of the alien invading the human body that connects Sputnik with the Alien films. And they also share a lot of the same concerns. Themes of heroism and guilt penitence are present. There's a strong-willed female protagonist fighting against the powers that be, trying to use the alien as a weapon and willing to do great things, willing to go to great lengths to harness its power, including most obviously the sacrifice of human life. But more productive than perhaps pointing out these similarities would be the differences. What are the key changes that Sputnik makes in its restaging of the Alien films? And what are some of these most salient differences? First and foremost, it's set in the Soviet past rather than the American future. The top interests here are state rather than corporate. And the alien is itself symbiotic rather than parasitic. So the Alien films are set in a somewhat distant future, and the impetus for the narrative is corporate interests. A big, powerful corporation on Earth wants to harness the alien's power. They see the lives of all of its employees and soldiers who they sent off as completely expendable. And for this reason, it's a pretty straightforward critique of a seemingly dystopian reality where corporate interests reign supreme. But Sputnik complicates this picture significantly, I think, by setting its action in the last decade of the Soviet Union. The supreme authority is now state authority, but not even that. Here, state authority is divided between center and periphery. On the one hand, there's the far-off Moscow bureaucracy who know little about what's going on at this institute. And then there's this peripheral institute in Kazakhstan, which sees Semiradov as the ultimate authority here. And he's working for the state, but maybe to some extent also for himself. He's turned this institute, to follow with what Julie was saying about biopolitics, into a state of exception of sorts, right? He's allowing the extrajudicial killings of these prisoners and covering it up for the sake of controlling the alien. And much like an alien, the bodies of the prisoners and really the protagonist, the doctor, anyone who might get in Semiradov's way, they're all expendable. But this is where it's most interesting for me. The film seems most preoccupied with categorizing human beings according to their actions. It creates a kind of ontological hierarchy of categories of the human. At the top, there's heroes like Vishnyakov, and at the bottom, there's the criminals, the rapists and the murderers that Semiradov feeds to the aliens and deems at various parts not human or mere fodder. At the same time, we see how the state uses both heroes and criminals as tools to achieve its aims. It kind of flattens out this hierarchy into one category, human material. And whether hero or criminal, these characters are all working in the service of the state, it seems. Even though some clearly have individual desires, personal glory. Vishnyakov mentions that he sees himself as some great hero, or the doctor is often made mention to in reference to a Nobel Prize. In the end, they're really humbled by these powers greater than their individual desires. And this leads me to the main difference here, that the alien is symbiotic. It gives life as much as it takes life from the host. If we are indeed to read the alien as a metaphor for the deteriorating Soviet state, it maybe strengthens the idea that the state needs human material for existence. And on the other hand, does this also mean that the people need the state just as much as it needs them? Maybe rather that state power is introduced violently and artificially and insinuates itself in the human personality to such an extent that it becomes indispensable. So, I think there is an argument to be made that this is in some ways a more elegant critique of power than maybe the Alien franchise put forth. And at the end of the day, I was thrilled from beginning to end. So, it might not be the most original and it might be a little sloppy in some of the details, but I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Glad to hear that.
Thank you very much, Tomi. And that actually gives what Tomi just talked about, gives us a perfect jumping off point to going a little bit more in detail to conversation about Ridley Scott. And just want to respond to one point that Eliot made about pseudoscience. For the sci-fi fans out there, I was completely flabbergasted recently because someone told me that in all of science fiction ever, especially now, all of the spaceships do not have to be aerodynamic, so they don't have to be shaped like, like shuttle and everything else, because there is no air, and especially if it's launched from a different planet where there is no atmosphere, it doesn't have to break the atmosphere to be that shaped. And it completely blew me away, and just thought I would put it out there in terms of pseudoscience and for just how long we had all of those semi-phallic shaped rockets. Well, there was absolutely no need for that to be happening if we're talking about science. But on a perhaps more Sputnik specific note, of course, we have to talk about Ridley Scott in greater detail. And Abramenko said, and I quote, "Alien is in my film's DNA," using the very apt genetic metaphor there. So in your assessment, is this a riff? And if it's not just a riff, what is there anything unique about Sputnik other than the setting, of course?
And you may speak in any order.
In any order.
Yes, Tomi, please go ahead.
First of all, I'm just kind of surprised that he only mentioned the first Alien film when it's the one that has kind of the least content to it. And that's maybe why it's the favorite of the bunch, because it's kind of pure horror. There's not that much to think about, and it's mostly just an experience than it is a kind of exercise in this critique of power, that especially the third Alien film, which is, as we were discussing, one of the less well-received ones. So I'm wondering why did Abramenko only mention Ridley Scott's film, which, of course, as I said, it has the alien invading the human body. That's, we have to owe it to Ridley Scott for that one. But beyond that, I think the rest of the franchise informed the film maybe more than the first one. So I just want to put that out there.
Colleagues. Yes, Yulia, please.
Okay, so I actually like the first Alien movie the best, probably, but I've only seen the first three. So I'm not sure about the other ones. And I think that there is a major difference, right? As you said, Tomi, and the difference is that the first Ridley Scott's Alien is not really necessarily about power, and it's more about biology, right? I think it's about biology. Meanwhile, Sputnik is obviously about the problem of culture. So I think the fear is completely different, right? So the Ridley Scott's Alien is made in the 70s, which is the time when modern biotechnology is born, right? This is the time when recombinant DNA technologies are created, gene sequencing, right? This is where transgenic synthesis is coming up. All of this is giving a lot of anxiety to people about how to deal with these new technologies and how these new technologies will be manipulated. And I think that's what the film is really about, Alien. Meanwhile, Sputnik is about, as I said, to me, right, it's about cultural contamination. And right, and so the kind of metaphor that he gives, right, alien is in my film's DNA. I read it literally as him basically saying that the film dramatizes what the very point that American culture and the alien culture is in DNA of a Russian contemporary artist, that contamination with otherness is, you know, much more permanent and complete, and that there is much more of a sense in this film that separation is not possible. There is no possibility for separation, right? That we are desperately and permanently contaminated with otherness, which you don't get in alien movies, at least in the first ones, right? In alien movies, there is definitely the kind of intrusion, but it is not this kind of permeability and porousness in which you are the other and the other are you, and there is no way to tell the difference, right? And that brings us back to the point that Tomi made, that the Alien franchise is about parasites. Right. Meanwhile, here we're dealing with the situation of symbiosis. It's very important, right? Sputnik is about the absolute inability to disentangle from the other. And that's why what's very important is that otherness is not relegated to creatures and inmates. It is, right, our hero and our heroine are marked by otherness, right? Our hero, you know, they have encountered otherness within them much before they met the creature, right? We know that the hero is weak and egotistical. We know that the heroine is cyborgian. We see her scar. It seems like there is some kind of medical intervention that has taken place. So there is some kind of constituent absence at the very core of their being, right? That potentially is inhuman. So this is what to me is very interesting about the film, right? That there is this inability to disentangle oneself from the other, and at the same time, the filmmaker's imagination is in symbiotic relationship with the alien culture, both weakened and strengthened by its indebtedness to Hollywood cinema, right? Even though the setting is the 80s, there is no way that film could have been made in the 80s, right? This is the film about the cultural landscape, about the cultural landscape of the millennials, right? Of this kind of post-fall of the Berlin Wall, the global culture moment where we are all enmeshed, when we're all convergent, right? Where we're all global. And so, of course, it's not possible for the filmmaker to retrieve historical memory without being contaminated with the artistic tools at his disposal. Which are the artistic tools that he's using? Are the tools of the Hollywood cinema, right? And so, yeah, so that's what basically I think is interesting. And just like one last thing that I want to say about that is that Sputnik, right, the word that Dasha, you talked about, to me, Sputnik has always had that kind of ironic ring to it, because, right, it's it was this technical contraption to demonstrate one's preeminence in power in the world. It's not about, right, to accompany someone, right? It's not about cohabitation. And meanwhile, what it seems the film did is in a way kind of removed this ironic tint from the work, because the film is in fact about cohabitation, right? So, so yeah, I guess that's it for now.
Thank you, Yuri. It's very interesting. Eliot, I'll give you a floor in just a second. But what you said reminded me of sort of Prigov's commentary to the alien cycle, where he was observing it, and I don't think he seen the last one, but his idea was that from the film to film, the distance between Sigourney Weaver's character and the alien becomes shorter and shorter and shorter until they completely sort of collapse. It collapses and then they become the same, right? So in this respect, Sputnik looks like the sort of the next part of this cycle. So that they are the same. Let's begin from here. Eliot, I'm sorry.
No, I was actually going to start with something very much like that. That by Alien 4, the one you didn't see, and I'm not recommending it strongly by any means, by Alien 4, Ripley and the xenomorph have become hybrids of each other and are actually swapping reproductive systems. It was very strange. But I really liked what Yulia was saying about the film, and I think it made a great deal of sense. However, when it comes to cohabitation and incorporating difference, I think the film embodies it in process as we're watching, but the overall thrust of it is about the impossibility of cohabitation and the eradication of difference. Not only does Vishnikov have to kill himself to get rid of this creature and save, you know, the world, or at least the Soviet Union or someone, or Tanya, but also, again, Tanya's whole profession and her big mistake or whatever in the beginning has to do with trying to bring someone into the norm. And get rid of what is different about them. This can remind us of what, you know, psychiatrists and psychology used to be. They were alienists, right? And she is trying to disalienate the people that she is treating. And she has also, of course, gone through this herself as a disabled subject who has managed to become complete, if you don't see her in the shower, completely indistinguishable from a person who does not have any particular differences. The riff on Ridley Scott that I think is interesting here is to think of it as a variation on Alien's body horror, because the body horror, particularly of the first film, famously has been interpreted as being about male pregnancy and the male body being penetrable in ways that it's not supposed to be, right? And if you think of what happens there, the life cycle works so that you are men and women are infected by having something shoved through their mouths, and then something bursts out of the chest, right? Which is horrific. The salad scene, we all get that. Here, of course, the creature emerges from his mouth. It doesn't make it, you know, beautiful or unscary, but it's kind of the opposite path. Whereas no one has their chest burst open exactly, but that kind of opening up of the body is displaced onto Tanya, who had her entire body presumably ripped open, if you look at those scars, to correct whatever it was that was preventing her from walking. So a lot of these tropes get redistributed, and I think for a different effect, because ultimately, again, strangely enough, what I think is really interesting here is that the reproductive concern ends up being displaced, like everything else is displaced, to be about adopting. Even Vishnikov would even be adopting his own son because he's never seen it. Tanya adopts the son. It all happens so easily. That suggests a kind of non-biological reparation of a biological failure, which is a way that I was about to say the Alien franchise didn't exactly go, but it did in Alien 2 when Ripley kind of adopts the little girl who dies between film 2 and 3, but there she is.
But don't you think, speaking about this subject of adoption, which both you and Julia touched, don't you think that this entire build up, which is very melodramatic, of course, right? Mm-hmm. With the boy/girl who is trying to reach for Snickers, right?
Yeah,
etc. And which culminates in the final moment when Tanya adopts apparently Vishnikov's son, but until that moment we were sure that this child is indeed Vishnikov's son, right? It transforms it in a very strange and I don't know if intentional moment of self-adoption.
Mm-hmm.
She basically adopts herself. So this child is her.
Mm-hmm.
So she is this next generation person supposedly. So it's some kind of the weird temporal connection here.
It does make sense, but there are two other things going on with that I just want to mention because I think it's fascinating. One is, of course, the fake out, right? We think it's the boy, and it's not. I mean, this is also not new. Westworld did it in the first season, the sort of breaking up of time so that you don't know what you're watching. This Is Us does it every other episode. It's a familiar phenomenon, but the way it works here ends up being about, among other things, the confusion of gender, which is fascinating given the question of responsibility and reproduction here, and also in that when they're talking about the creature is tvar. Tvar is feminine, so it's anan. They're referring to yo, but sometimes they slip and say yevo, and in part that's because we're not sure if we're talking about the creature or talking about Vishnikov. So the gender slippage about the creature and even about Vishnikov himself to some extent is mirrored by this whole boy-girl thing.
Yeah, that's true. Yulia, you wanted to say something, I'm sorry.
Yes, I just wanted to say something about that, the adoption, and how I found it to be different in Aliens, right? It wasn't Alien, it was Aliens. In Aliens, Ripley, right? Ripley adopts Newt. Because, right, there is some kind of affinity that is not, she doesn't adopt Newt because of some kind of maternal instinct. She adopts Newt because they're both soul survivors and they share, right, some kind of feelings of guilt and mourning and experience. And so there is this connection on the basis of this kind of affinity of experience. Meanwhile, I found it I found it less interesting when Klimova adopts the son of the man whom she felt amorous towards, because it seemed to, even though there is, of course, like Mark, you're right, there is, of course, also some kind of affinity connection. They're both orphans, so there is that experience. But at the same time, there is a kind of a return of this maternal that the film Sputnik felt it needs to give to Klimova. It somehow felt that it wasn't enough for her, right? Like that they didn't want Klimova to be androgynous, which to me was a problem in this film, right? Because again, the film is about some kind of post-human aspect. And I thought that it was interesting, that Alien was precisely interesting because Ripley was androgynous, both in body and in character, her characteristics, right? That were rational and strong and non-sentimental and not very, right, not like necessarily morally good, right, but just a kind of a survival machine that they made her to be. I thought that was a very interesting character. And it seemed strange to me, right, that the Sputnik decided to say, yes, our Klimova is also like that. She's also strong and she's also adaptable and also smart. But she also has these kind of feelings of love and care, right? And we want to insist on that, on gender difference and differentiation. So it's very easy then to start reading her caring and nurturing side as being part of her being a woman, right? Which I thought was a weaker solution, primarily because it's a cliche, right? And also it's a weaker solution because in this film that I read as a film about a kind of convergence of cultures and symbiosis of cultures, I felt that there is a little bit here in which there is a little of competitiveness with the American side. It's to say, yes, your Ripley is great, of course, right? But ours, she has all those same qualities, but she also has that universal responsiveness, right? She also has that what is that, всемирная отзывчивость, and that love, right? That she feels. So ours is just a tiny bit better, right? So that I thought was problematic, yeah. And in addition, and that's just to kind of comment also on the whole problem with adoption, that the adoption, I thought, of Newt was a more interesting solution than in the movie Sputnik.
So since we already jumped to the, Dasha, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to comment on that, because that's the only actually part of the film that to me was a bit unsettling. I don't want to necessarily push back against what Julia said, but just kind of as an alternative vision to that. I actually found Tanya fundamentally not maternal throughout the film, like very much not a mother figure, partly because I think I'm influenced by the casting choice. Akinshina to me is like the least motherly actress in contemporary Russian cinema. So to me, the epilogue actually, the first impression was they did not need to do that. Like that was a completely gratuitous epilogue, which could be motivated, I think, with what Julia said, that like, you know, the woman, maybe she's better than Ripley, but she still has to be feminine. To me, however, you know, that does tie into the protagonist that actually does have more complexity than a lot of women characters in contemporary Russian cinema, because there is no, like, there is a sexual tension, but there is no resolution to that at all in Sputnik, which I was surprised by, because usually, even if it's a lady central protagonist in Russian cinema, both genre and art, she's kind of the function of the male. Like she will be ultimately mother, wife, daughter, sister, whatever. She's not going to be a character with agency. While in Sputnik, she arguably is the only character with agency. So I didn't personally read it as kind of one-upmanship with Alien, but I think that to me, it just didn't seem much motivated by the narrative altogether. Like to me, her concern about Vishnyakov was more about, this is not human rights, this is inhuman, rather than I'm going to be a nurturing motherly figure to her. Just wanted to put it out there as an alternative read. We have both Julia and then Tomi. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I just want to respond that I agree with you completely. I also think that, of course, she's a much more interesting character than female character than in many other Russian movies. However, and you're right, she's much colder. She's much colder than what one would expect from a Russian female character. But this kind of, there is this kind of sexual tension, as you said, between her and the hero. She's attracted to that hero. But what was very interesting about Alien, what was revolutionary about Alien, is that it created a positive female character who was not in love with a male protagonist, which was radical, which was a radical gesture. So to take this away and to say, right, is something that
it weakens. No, I agree. Yeah. Like, I don't know if that was where you were going, but I think, it weakens, and it's not super motivated by the rest of the narrative.
Yeah.
Tomi, please.
Tomi.
I just want to point out, you might be giving the Alien movies a little too much credit here. I agree the first one does have this kind of gender confusion, but in the second one, we do have to remember the character of the alien queen, who does kind of stage like a battle of the mothers between Ripley, who's protecting her adopted daughter, and the queen, who is protecting all of her progeny, you know? So while the first one, I definitely understand Eliot's point about, male pregnancy, in the second one, I think the gender lines are a little more clearly established. Although I will say, I am very impressed that even in the third one, when they do give Ripley a love interest, they kill him very quickly. Before halfway through the movie, they finally give her a love interest, and then bam, he's dead immediately, which I think is pretty cool also. Please.
Okay, right. Eliot, Yulia, very brief because we need to move on. We're already talking for 45 minutes and we're on our first question, believe it or not. Right.
Which is amazing, but also we need to move.
Okay, just very quickly, the adoption tagged on thing was very hard to buy, and does seem to be playing this role for the character. But actually, what I found even harder to swallow was the sexual tension between her and the cosmonaut, which felt like it was we were made to see that it was there. But I saw no evidence of chemistry. They may as well have a glass wall between them the entire time. Maybe seeing a guy throw up an alien out of his mouth is really hot, and that really does it for her. But it seemed like they had to have sexual tension because it's a man and a woman who are the main characters. But I saw no basis for it except for some sort of basic biology. Otherwise, they just could have been in two different worlds.
I think the film is playing with this very well. Remember this episode when he's moved to the normal room with the bed, and the camera looks at this bed for a long time. And if you look closely, there are men's pants sitting on the back of this bed, and so you're expecting something, nothing happens, right? So that's part of a game. Yulia, please.
Yeah, just to respond to Tomi about aliens and the combat between two mothers, right? I agree with you, but on the other hand, again, there is a major distinction between the motherhood of this replicating, self-generating motherhood, and Ripley, who has this kind of cultural motherhood, or a kind of protective, right, leadership that she takes, that is very different, again, from this kind of instinctual, natural biological phenomenon that I find to be problematic. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So I have a feeling that you have more fun talking about Alien than about Sputnik. Let's get back to Sputnik, right? And here is the question that is very important for us. Basically, as we all know, science fiction is the art of allegories and symbols, right? And here the symbolism, as you were interpreting, and here I'm following Tomi's interpretation, is definitely associated with the state, right? And with the demise of the state, and the temporal tags pointing at Andropov's reign and Afghanistan are quite important there, right? Then of course, this suggests a reading of this entire sci-fi plot with the alien as the story of relations with the totalitarian past, right? Especially since the alien is being fed with Gulag inmates, right? And thus the entire plot line is about impossibility to separate Soviet project from totalitarian project, and thus symbolic suicide of Vishnikov as the symbolic suicide of the USSR. So what do you think about this? I'm not insisting that this is the only one possible reading of this film, but definitely the metaphor of the death of the USSR, death of the Soviet project, or on the other hand, impossibility to separate Soviet project from the Soviet man. Now it sounds especially serious, right? And or especially erroneous, right? Or even ironic, I would say. On the other hand, probably it looks completely different when watched through Hulu as just another sort of stylized sci-fi. So what do you think generally about this political or symbolical interpretation of this movie?
Just a quick note before I'm abusing my privileges as moderator, obviously,
No,
but for the audience in on Zoom, the inmates feeding scene was the one that got most criticism from kind of both Russia and the US critics, just for, it didn't seem to a lot of critics that it was motivated by the narrative. So that's partially why we wanted to kind of add that to the question.
However, it is symbolically motivated, of course, right? If we perceive this creature as the symbol of the past, that's clearly the necessary element. Sir, the floor is yours. Eliot, go ahead.
Just very quickly, yeah, I think that all works. But I think there's an aspect of it that's easy to forget because it's only in the beginning, or not to pay attention to, that this thing is brought in from outer space. That is the Soviet space program, the crown jewel of everything that the Soviet Union was doing after World War II, that had played such a powerful symbolic role, is what brings this thing down and threatens to destroy the entire country, perhaps. And I think that, yeah, feeding the Zeks, that's really, kind of obvious and all that, but it's more interesting to have that as a counterpoint to the space program, right? Because in a sense, you have these two big things going on with the country, going up into outer space and then sort of chewing people up in the camps, both of which involve like getting people out to the middle of nowhere, either to keep them there or to send them into space. So I don't think they normally occupy the same symbolic space, even if they do have some shared geographic space. So putting them together here was, I think, kind of interesting. Otherwise, the feeding reminded me of a kind of inverse of Pelevin's Norma, where you just have to eat your share of shit.
Yes, but isn't this what Tomi spoke about, that both space program and Gulag are a state of exception following Agamben's logic, and they are, as Agamben teaches us, are at the foundation of modern state. And so here we are dealing with the sort of initial events or initial conditions of the state, and thus Vishnikov, with this monster inside whom he, as we learn, controls, right, is indeed the post-human metaphor of the modern state. But Yulia promised to speak about good and bad biopolitics. Maybe that's where this would be handy.
Yeah. So I agree with what has been said already by several people, right? That the kind of the budding love affair and the adoption, all of that was unnecessary. But the scenes of inmates being fed, to me, that was essential, precisely because, right, that was to me the most important thing, because that's at the core of this ethical questioning and post-humanist concerns of the film, right? It's all about biopolitics, just like what Mark said, right? If the people had not been sacrificed for the hero to survive, or more importantly, for the strengthening of the state apparatus, right, and preservation, then that omission would have made the alien into E.T., right? It would be just, right, and the movie would become a kind of E.T. It would be rather, right, about the kind of bad state trying to co-opt and instrumentalize relationships. Meanwhile, what we really want to talk about is about biopolitics, right? We want to talk about the difference between Semiradov's view of correct beneficial course of action in the face of a collective threat versus Klimov's, right? And Semiradov thinks in terms that separates, and this is what Tomi already said, right? That separates the world into us and them, and heroes and creatures, and humans and subhumans, and those who should be protected and those who should be disposed of or can be disposed, those who are disposable. And this type of thinking is, right, whom to make live or let die, right? That is at the core of the functioning of the modern biopolitical state. And that's what shows what the movie is really about. So yes, what the symbolism is about, right? It's about biopolitics. But what I would really want,
alternative.
But what I want to say, yes, the alternative. So the alternative, just like the movie makers cannot really can not really exit their contemporary moment and kind of bypass it and think through everything through the lens of their moment. I am thinking about everything through the lens of our moment, right? And we're currently in this state of exception, right? Which has not been created by the state apparatus. At least I don't think so, right? So we are in the middle of a pandemic right now. And so we cannot afford to be following Agamben and Foucault and their critique of biopolitical state, because that would potentially push us into this kind of QAnon conspiracy theory, right? So we don't want to be there. We want those vaccines. At least I really want that vaccine as soon as possible, right? So the question is, how are we going to reconceptualize the biopolitical? Right. The question is this biopolitical, right, the kind of biopolitical threat and our suspicion of the biopolitical state that has been created by Foucault and Agamben, and we taught all of this, right? That it's exhausted itself. So we need some kind of new understanding of biopolitics. And so I am curious to what extent we can possibly think of what Klimova wants, right? Which is, of course, what she wants is to save everyone, right? That's what Semiratov tells her. The problem is that you want to save everyone, right? You don't want to let a bunch of people die, right? So in order for the state to survive, or whatever, the whole to survive, right? And so I want to understand whether maybe we can use her or her solutions, I don't know, convergence, cooperation, empathy, affinity, collective vulnerability, responsibility for all, as a kind of attempt to conceptualize new, good biopolitical regime, because we need those vaccines now, right? We can't anymore think that we are free from the state and from the biopolitical machine. So I don't know. I don't know if it's possible to think about it in terms of, right, Semiratov is thinking, his strategy is to think about everything in terms of defense and war, and hers is to think in terms of assimilation. I'm wondering actually if it's possible, might be possible to think about that, that mistake she makes at the beginning, where she is, where she's almost drowning a child in order to cure the child of seizures. I don't understand how it works medically. I can't presume to understand, but I'm wondering if, again, it is something about some kind of mutual assimilation, or assimilation to conditions, something that could help us reconceptualize the realm of that biopolitical. And the film at the end actually also presents her point of view. Let's try to save everyone, right? Being responsible for everyone as a mistake, because she actually says it's a mistake. Right, but it's still something that is an ideal to aspire to, right? And so, and considering that the point, right, the kind of the idea of perseverance in the face of physical environmental limitations is rewarded at the end, whether we, like the solution or not, right? Because she perseveres. She has all these environmental and physical limitations, but she manages to save herself somehow. So maybe what the film is saying is that there is a possibility in which we can somehow create a space, a political space in which everyone gets saved. I don't know, but this is something I would like to think about.
Mm-hmm.
If just
Eliot had a comment.
Yeah. Okay, Eliot, go ahead.
I like this idea. I think she's a terrible candidate for that role for two reasons. One, her therapeutic methods are kind of turning her into a mini copy of the state. She's waterboarding someone. She's basically using Guantanamo / Gulag methods to try to cure someone, and she just gets lucky that she doesn't kill him. But two, even if we accept that mode of treatment and we see her being much more humane, Vishnikov, into this creature, the problem here then ends up looking like a problem of liberal humanitarianism, because the state at the very least can think on large scale, and Semiradov is thinking on a large scale. The best she can do is retail, which is very, that is, she can save one person at a time. And she can handle one person's problem at a time. That is her profession. But it's not, I don't think it gives us a model then for how to deal with the things that the state, for how to deal with something on a large scale. And that is in fact where she fails, because she's putting the country at risk by taking him out with her.
I completely agree with Yulia about vaccines, so don't catch me on that. So looking at, and I agree with this sort of ideal biopolitics, but doesn't it fail spectacularly? Because at the end, everybody is dead, right? But plus the number of soldiers that had been killed by this monster during the escape probably is similar as the number of Zaks who
very important.
This monster had consumed, right? So the balance is there, and I'm thinking that this child adoption in the end is necessary exactly in order to tip this balance, to show no, she saves at least one. Right? But she doesn't save, right? So this method is too brilliant to be practical, right? So Tomi didn't say anything on this issue, but Tomi said in the beginning, so I wouldn't press hard. Maybe we should move on to the next problem of ours.
Nancy, just kind of a quick side note about how she fails to save, because she's just one and then jeopardizing the state, etc. It's perhaps telling something about kind of like the state of critique in mainstream cinema in Russia, that all forms of protest are incredibly individualistic and can then be construed as also the character who is resisting as just kind of like keeping her own agenda. I mean, obviously she does kind of jeopardize herself too, but most films that do possess some form of like revisiting past traumas, maybe this is also about the present. Of course it is about the present. It is always by one character who is profoundly individualistic in their views, which I think is kind of goes back to the state of Russian liberalism today, but we can probably talk about that later. Now about genre, since we're still talking about a horror and a fairly mainstream horror film. So horror, as we know, used to be kind of an underexplored genre for many years, including in the kind of first post-Soviet years. Now it is suddenly back to being popular, and significant advances have been made in contemporary Russian cinema for bringing it up to international film market standard. However, the attempts to set a horror film in the Soviet Union have been scarce to none, and this one is probably the first real major popular mainstream horror set in the Soviet Union. So my question is, what do you make of this historical setting? And kind of to problematize it further, why not set it in the present? Like, everything will hold up just as well in contemporary Russia, and it wouldn't cross into the critique that would be too dangerous for Abramenko. Like, that wouldn't be too much, let's put it this way. So why set it in the Soviet Union? Why not now? And generally, what do you make of the setting?
Yes, Tomi, go ahead.
This is a question that I've also been wondering, because, the Abramenko or the scriptwriters, they don't need to be making this critique of Soviet power. Mm-hmm. I don't know how young the screenwriters are. They might be just as young as Abramenko. So it does confuse me. Why is this set in the past? And I think there's something to be said that, there are all the right ingredients in Soviet times for a good horror movie. There's, the machinations of the state, There's dark, secret hallways far off somewhere. And the space program does itself have all of the right ingredients also. So I don't know, I'd love to think of it as motivated by some ideological concern, but it could very well just be a formal concern. He thought that this is where a good horror movie can be found.
Thank you. Eliot.
Hello.
There's a two-word answer to this that's facetious, which is cell phones. Obviously, there wouldn't be cell phone reception out there, but something really, there was a challenge to thriller and horror storytelling in the late 90s when everybody had cell phones. And you could not have the kind of isolation you would count on beforehand. And it took a few years for Western cinema and television to incorporate them in a way so that they could exploit that as a positive thing rather than a negative. And I think for all the other things aside, the sheer communicative isolation that is facilitated, in particular in a pre-internet age, they could have gotten around it, but it helps the movie.
Yulia, I want to turn this question to you based on what you said before. So you were arguing that the form of this film sort of is, the story is reflective of the form of the film that sort of consumes the Western author. But don't you think that the same can be said about sort of the Sovietness as the other that is being sort of consumed by the film as the source, literally, of uncanny? So the Soviet as the skeleton in the closet.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that assessment. I think, however, right, I'm thinking again, like, I don't think that it is about necessarily consumption. It's more a kind of entanglement that is impossible to disentangle oneself out of, right? It's a kind of permeability that is impossible to, that is the condition, that is the cultural condition that I think the film explores. And to that degree, what I want to say about the Soviet aspect, why the Soviet aspect is important, or at least the way how it functions in my understanding, or via my thought that this film is about this kind of post-humanism, right, is that it attempts to deal with the concept of the new Soviet man and what this project entails. And one of the things, again, right, that why it made sense to place it in the Soviet time is to kind of show the unfeasibility of the project of the creation of this new Soviet man, right? The sort of the problems with it, and the kind of idea, again, of purity, and this kind of narrative of purity that was present in this very idea of this new Soviet man. And by the way, that was also very important to Russian cosmism and space project, right? Because the whole space project, Russian space project, is based on Nikolai Fyodorov's, right, on Russian cosmism, sort of, and Nikolai Fyodorov's philosophy of the common task, right? So, which is the idea that is based on self-sufficiency, right? When Tsiolkovsky starts creating his rockets, he's thinking precisely what he's very interested in this whole idea of self-sufficiency, right? Because Fyodorov says we need to resurrect ancestors, but you don't want to resurrect ancestors that are then going to die, right? Like, what, you want to resurrect humanity so that it will live forever, right? So you need immortality, but the only way you can create immortality is if you evolve humanity. If you evolve humanity to be self-sufficient, not dependent on nature, not dependent on others. And so when Tsiolkovsky is thinking about his rocket, right, his rocket market. He's thinking precisely about the creation of the kind of self-sufficiency that you won't be dependent on the earth, you won't be dependent on nature, right? And so this becomes this kind of purity and self-sufficiency that is a very important idea. And for our hero, for what's his name, Vishnikov, that the idea of purity is important, right? He's a hero, he says he's a hero. And for Semiryadov, it is important because he wants to categorize and separate impure elements from pure elements, right? So the idea of purity is very, very central here. And it's specifically connected to the space project, to the Soviet project, and it's problematic. One of the most interesting parts of the movie to me, right, is how Semiryadov and the hero, Vishnikov, how they lie to each other about the knowledge that there is this, that there is the alien within, right? Semiryadov doesn't want Vishnikov to know because somebody, right, it's like in Pilemets Oman Ra, because somebody has to believe in the narrative of purity for this narrative to be true. And Vishnikov doesn't want to expose his knowledge also because he's invested in the narrative of purity, right? So, but this narrative of purity is unsustainable. And by the way, I actually read the suicide at the end, not as a heroic act. I read it as an admittance that, yes, I am in fact is dependent, contingent, and finite. And I'm going to show you that I'm finite. I'm going to kill myself. This is how I read it, right? That at the end, he basically understands that he's not this autonomous, heroic being that is immortal, but that he is, right, that he is deeply enmeshed, right, that he's impure and he's contingent and he's dependent. And therefore, he is finite. And he shows that he's finite by killing himself, right? He at first takes the alien inside, and then he kills himself. And to me, this is a kind of critique of the whole idea of purity on which the new Soviet man and the kind of cosmism was and the Russian space project, Soviet space project were based on. Yeah.
Can I say, I think that's brilliant.
Eliot and Tomi. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think you can connect your discussion of purity back to your earlier discussion of the implantation of the Western genre into the Soviet subject, because there's a purity of genre going on here in that these characters are naive to the genre. The only people in any way connected to this film who haven't seen the Alien franchise are these people. And that actually means something, because if you watch a lot of genre movies today, that what happens is you have people who are meta characters in it because they've seen all the movies. And this is the last moment when you can have you have the infusion of the genre coming in, which is almost temporally appropriate. It's just about when it's going to happen. But when you have people who don't know the story that they're in, and that is that allows for something that's kind of innocent.
Tomi, I think I was going to say something.
I just have a question on this topic to Julia, because it's so relevant to my own work. What's in it for a filmmaker in 2020 to criticize a new Soviet man? You know, this concept that at this point is a century old. You might not have an answer. I don't necessarily have an answer myself.
I might throw something as a brief.
No, sir, Mark, you were first. You go.
I know what you're going to talk about, so I will just bridge it. Those of us, Dasha has already mentioned the Tao project as sort of the subconscious of contemporary culture. And as you remember, in the Tao, one of the central episodes was called Novые люди, new people, and those new people also were quite monstrous. So Dasha, I think that the connection with Tao is something that you wanted to ask about, right?
Yeah, and I actually wanted to also kind of maybe potentially address, well, Tommy's question about the significance of the new Soviet man now, kind of where does it leave us? I will say, so, well, there's the kind of, from the standpoint of genre cinema, so many films about astronauts came out of Russia in the past 5 years that it's, at this point, it's just like, come on already, come up with something else. So there is kind of, on a very basic level, there is this idea of constituting a foil to very banal, very trite, and kind of entirely based on cliches, patriotic cinema about astronauts. The CGI is great, but they're usually very poorly written. But in terms of Dow and research, and then that might also go back to biopolitics, I'm curious about the chronotope of this knee of the scientific institute, because while everything else is it's still from kind of Ridley Scott's genre playbook, aliens, astronauts, violent state, and the alien is capitalism, here it's socialism. But this knee thing seems to be a slightly more domestic product in a horror, although there are institutes of all sorts of in Hollywood cinema too. So I'm wondering if you have any views on why did this particular space become a place for a horror film. And again, with regards to Dow of course was not meant to be a horror film, but ended up being so many horror films based on just one project. And there, of course, there's also the idea of a research institute, and both in Dow and here they function as states of exception. Like these are the states of exception that are in a horror, and then the other thing. So what do you make of this chronotope? What about the setting? How would you interpret that as kind of both a phenomenon in Russian cinema and as a maybe a reflection on historical trauma?
And what do the new people have to do with this?
Mm-hmm.
Any ideas? Eliot, first thing.
Less about Dow than there's an interesting progression that in the 90s in a lot of genre fiction, like trashy mysteries and sort of thrillers and all of that, the easy way to explain anything unusual was KGB mad science. That it came out of some place that's just a почтовый ящик, right? The mailbox number. And so in the 90s, you have all of the stuff coming out of the box, but you don't actually explore the box. And I think it's great that now we're opening up the box and seeing what's inside it.
Monsters.
Monsters. I mean, I don't know. I find that it's kind of endearing, no? Like with the big ears. Anything to add?
He's totally partially cute. I definitely think, right, that there is something, sometimes he looks scary and sometimes he looks kind of like E.T. There is something like, and the fact that there is all this kind of desire to touch, and when he hugs, when the alien clings to that toy, that's just adorable,
yes.
Right? That's just adorable. But about the sort of secret research and the hero and the fear connected to secret research and the kind of psychological manipulation, I wonder the extent to which, how do I respond to? I just want to bring it back to this kind of the creation of the new Soviet man very briefly, right? That, I wrote in the past about the kind of bodily, stealing and sort of biomechanics and so on. But in this film, it's all about the creation of the new Soviet man is done via persuasion, right? Some kind of psychological manipulation. And the whole film, the horror of the film is not in this adorable creature, but this kind of right, the manipulation of somebody's fear, the creature is manipulating the fear of the inmates, and Semiryadov is manipulating and intimidating the scientists, and right. So there is, and Klimova herself is also trying to create some kind of a psychological or affect some kind of psychological manipulation of the creature, right? Reach some kind of understanding with the creature, right? So there is all that. So I think the maybe the connection between the kind of secret secret research place that attempts to, the kind of Manchurian candidate that attempts to play with our minds and transform us and change us, right? Maybe it works well for us now because we are in the middle of this kind of internet, tentacular internet life that is also, we are constantly, vulnerable to manipulation by various images and narratives, and where are they coming from, and who knows, right, where the threat is. By the way, that is another very interesting thing about the film, right, is that for a while it's unclear where the threat is coming from.
Yeah.
So, there are all these cameras, but who's watching whom, you don't know, you don't understand. This is right. So that creates some kind of unpleasant reaction. But to me, the most horrific part of the film was when Semiriadov is trying to tell Klimova that she's exactly like him. That's right. To me, that was a moment of sheer horror, right? And that is a kind of horror of the psychological manipulation associated with, again, this kind of secret research places that are trying to tell us that we are these kind of people as opposed to these kind of people, right? So I don't know, maybe we are more with all this like misinformation that we're being constantly fed right now, and how easy it is, clearly, by looking at our politics. We don't have to go to Russia for that. We can look what's going on around here, how easy it is for people to kind of lose the way and be manipulated by misinformation. Maybe this, the part of history that has to do with these kind of social experiments of manipulation, is something that really is speaking to us right now. Yeah.
Thank you.
Tomi?
Tomi, please go ahead.
First of all, I just want to add that it really is a little cute, and I showed this movie to a friend, and that was his first reaction. Also, it's a little adorable at times.
Times.
But makes a really lovely noise sometimes. Like, and I really like this kind of look.
On topic though, this idea of the secret institute, this image or chronotope, as you say, it could be a generic variant of something that I just watched another film that you're going to be discussing, Dear Comrades, recently, which is about a secret history coming to light after so many years. And a secret institute like that might just be a generic variant in science fiction or horror films of that same kind of thing, a secret history that has so far been kept under lock and key, been kept away from public knowledge, but there's this belief that something that is unknown to us will be revealed with time. I mean, it's this kind of conspiratorial thinking that we see so much today, as Eliot discussed before.
And do you want to say something?
Just in terms of, Yulia mentioned what the most horrific moment of the film. I keep remember the most horrific moment of the film to me is in the beginning, the idea of being in a capsule in outer space for a month, listening to someone singing Million Alых Roz again and again and again. That stuck with me more than anything.
Yes, and of course, Akinshina singing Million Alых Roz to the monster.
Calm down.
Doubles this sin, right? Doubles this horror.
Yeah.
But don't you think that the indeed the parallel with Tao that Dasha suggested is informative, because in Tao all this idea of categorization of people is very much prominent, and Yulia would know better than me that the favorite theme in Tsiolkovsky's writing is categorization of people who should be resurrected first and who should be resurrected last. He wanted to secure his first position, right? So how many there were categories? 17 or 18, I remember.
It's like vaccines again.
Yeah. He was very serious about that. Very. So Tao and basically this approach in general, biopolitical, of course, is based on this categorization, as Yulia showed. And so scientific institute since the 60s is indeed the place of power. the place of symbolic power. That's where the smartest people reside. That's where the future is being created. And this mythology is completely inherited by the DAO project. Remember, Dasha and I, the colleague shared with us with the sort of fictional history of the institute that is written by one of the participants of this project. That's Pelevin, but Pelevin very much internalized, very much seriously taken. It is sort of the movement from scientific knowledge to occult knowledge and to the higher knowledge in general. Here we see basically the same motif, right? The same theory being unfolded in front of our eyes, right? And that's probably is the answer to Tommy's question about why this problematics of the new man is important, because it is still the open question, because it is still the ongoing project. The new man is being recreated non-stop, right? It started 100 years ago, but it's never ended.
Well, I think it also kind of would tie in well with the whole modernizing narrative that is still very much alive in Russia, and if anything, becoming stronger, and to what extent it is being maybe vilified to an extent through creating a space of an institute as the space of horror. Because modernizing and enlightening narrative obviously comes from up top. Not God, state. That's what I meant by that.
Yes. Right. Colleagues, I think we should move to our audience and maybe have some questions. We have a few comments in the Q&A from Yanis Sigilakis, very vibrant discussion. Thank you, Yanis, for being with us. Another is the question to Julia. Thinking about the idea of cultural contamination that is felt in the film, would you consider the theme of adoption as an extension of this idea, in a sense of a loss of the sense of origin? And I guess that's Julia has, of course, the first word, but maybe others would like to chip in.
Yes, I think it's an excellent question, and I agree that there is definitely the loss of the sense of origin is interesting. Of course, I thought about all these orphans, the proliferation of orphans, to be symbolic of the Soviet state, right? And because there were so many orphans in socialist realism, and the orphan is a kind of paradigmatic figure of socialist realist literature, right? Like you're supposed, you have one father, and we do have this one paternalistic figure, which is Semiryadov, and he's of course very problematic. So I was thinking about it in that way, but I think in terms of loss of origin, I think it's an interesting question. Again, this is a kind of a question that I associated more with aliens and the kind of adoption of mute, but I would be happy to also consider it in connection with Sputnik. Yeah.
Hello, Tomi, would you like to add? Mm-hmm. Okay, then let's move. Thank you, Julia. Move to Matthew Kendall's question. I have a related question. Like Eliot, I also found John Carpenter's The Thing a more compelling intertext than Alien. Carpenter, however, locates his research station in Antarctica, thus situating the horror genre in a truly alien space where national boundaries and many other boundaries become arbitrary. Based on what you all said so far, I'm wondering if Sputnik proves that staging a horror film within Soviet space is unavoidably always about Soviet space. Or do the film lose and actually transform this setting into alien space? It seems that a more thing like Sputnik could potentially be a truly new cinematic approach to the Soviet past, although I don't feel Abramenko achieved it. Thank you to everyone so far for great comments this evening. Thank you, Matthew, and I think that this is the question that everyone might want to address.
I'll start since I brought up The Thing. I think I agree with Matthew here completely. In terms of the Soviet space and horror, what I think might be, if not innovative, at least really interesting about this is that using the Soviet Union as such a great backdrop for a horror narrative, an audiovisual horror narrative, is a nice counterpoint to the usual deployments of the Soviet past in in film and television the past decade or so, right? Either you've got the Great Patriotic War, that's its whole thing, or this nostalgia-driven stuff about how nice things were, and really about this kind of everyday comfort. And I've been looking a lot at particular types of stories that send someone back to the Soviet past, the poppadance, this is whole science fiction subgenre, things like, well, it doesn't matter. But with those, what I'm arguing or plan to argue is that going back to the Soviet past is uncanny, but the uncanniness redounds to the present. The Soviet past ends up feeling normal, and our contemporary post-Soviet Russian world feels weird and odd and off, because going to the Soviet past is a kind of reset. But here, it's refreshing to see that that's not happening.
Yes, Yulia, Tomi, any ideas? Do you think that's not happening? So, while listening to what you said, I was actually thinking about this as some kind of the, ritualistic rehearsal of the initial event, and this initial event for the post-Soviet era, and so sort of was the post-Soviet era when this post-humanistic monster of the state had committed suicide and killed it, and then these cars are appearing and the new life is beginning. Here is a gem, and at the same time we are watching whatever we are watching and learning about new arrests and new political repressions and new things, Soviet, right, and sort of transformation of the Great Patriotic War into national religion, all this nice stuff, and it looks like a shamanistic act. So let's reenact it, this event, and stop this process. So it is not ahistorical. I think it's very much historical, and historical not in the alienating sense, but in the sense exactly as you guys said, of the impossibility to sever this past, sort of. And I think that what Dasha mentioned about the fashionable representation of this past, sort of beautiful outfits, stylish, I don't know, hairdo, etc., stylish and according to today's standards, it also sort of reflects this inseparability, not only aesthetic appeal.
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of in terms of both on the aesthetic appeal and going to go back to Matthew's question about where does it like bring us back as kind of a belated reckoning with the Soviet past, or is it about I think, to quote the question, within Soviet space is unavoidably always about Soviet space. Well, first of all, something that should be said is that this is a millennial filmmaker, all of which are now coming to artistic maturity. So it will always be a version of the Soviet that they have in their mind. And it is an important factor at this point. And the second thing, that's kind of to tie back with what Mark said about the Great Patriotic War becoming basically the new religion. Since there is a cult of Soviet nostalgia that has been steadily growing since at least the mid 2000s as something, as part of state ideology. In the 90s, it was not as tied into state ideologies as it had been since the mid 2000s, I would say. So it is always going to be about the present. To me, at this point, anything genre that is about the Soviet Union will have contemporary repercussions. But also there is a universality to horror that transcends any national context and any historical context at that. If we go back to, Carpenter, Brian De Palma, Wes Craven, all of those horror films have resonances across cultures, even the ones made in the 70s and kind of ostensibly being about the American way of life. In most general terms, all of the allegories of horror do hold quite well in other contexts just as well. So, Tomi?
I just want to point out that although this is set in Soviet space, again, it's a very exceptional Soviet space. It's the periphery and it's a secret institute. I mean, what would this movie look like if it were set in the center instead? I mean, the only the only scene set in, I don't know if they're in Petersburg or Moscow or where they are, but it's when, you know, when Klimova is being questioned by this group of people. And I mean, again, it's just a conference room that could be pretty much anywhere. So again, this is very thing-like in the sense that it's this exceptional space far off in the distance that I feel like does have it's analogous to, I mean, an exceptional space of the same kind in many other countries.
But absolutely, but to piggyback on what Mark was saying, this time ends up, if you think about it long enough, it's very pre-apocalyptic, right? Because it's just a couple years before Perestroika. It's almost like setting a movie a few years before Pompeii, right? Except that if you think forward, everything about the plot lines of anyone who survives just goes completely off the rails. You know, maybe Tanya eventually leaves state service and sets up her own shop where she drowns epileptic kids for money. That would be the future. But we're at the kind of last moment for this sort of thing to be happening, which is really interesting.
I will say that the only thing that I can think of, not exactly horror, but like the resonances and the fear of Cargo 200 that is said 1 year after this. Yeah. That's the only thing that I can think comes sort of close to a Soviet horror, but remember the resonance and 1984, and this is 1983. So horror and the apocalyptic, what Eliot said, like right on the cusp of the collapse.
And how Cargo 200 though, is horror, but avoiding so many of the things that make horror comfortable, because here we have all those audio cues again and again, and the most horrific thing about Cargo 200 is there no audio telling you now's when you're supposed to be afraid, because everything is just horrific at any particular moment.
Yeah.
So,
Yulia, do you have the last comment?
I don't have a question. I mean, I don't have an answer. It's more kind of like a question for me, right? It is 1983, right? Why is it specifically 1983? Is it something about Andropov, right? Is it something about that period? I mean,
1984 is too much on the nose, so.
Right, but also there is a kind of, right, but also in 1983, that's the moment where it could have gone either way. You know, who knows? Like if Andropov lived a little bit longer, who knows? It could have gone into like Stalinism, right? So I don't know. I was interested in why it was so specific about the year. It could have just placed it in the early 80s, and then we will already know that, you know, that we are on the cusp of you know, everything like on this kind of pre-apocalyptic path. But they were very specific about the year, and so I'm curious of what is it about that particular year, you know? I don't know. So that's the question.
I think Dasha's answer is very good. 1984 would be too
much on the nose.
Too direct of a connection, right? 1985 is typically said with Gorbachev, although.
Well, 85 is already perestroika, so that would make a little bit,
1982 is the year when Brezhnev dies. So it is a good year, right? So to speak, right? So colleagues, thank you very much. I think that your readings and your commentary have significantly enriched our perception of this movie, and our dedicated audience, thank you so much for staying with us. And I hope that if you haven't seen this movie, you would be intrigued to see it on Hulu or anywhere else where you will find it. And as to Dasha and me, I don't think that I'm stealing Dasha's voice here, because she will say herself, we had very pleasurable hour and a half talking with you guys about this film. That made it worth watching it, I would say.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Thank you very much. This was great. A lot of fun.
Yes, and our next meeting is
March
in 2 weeks.
8th. For Dead Souls, and it is an interesting production of Dead Souls as a contemporary adaptation. So,
is it March 8th or March 10th?
I think it's whatever is Monday of that week.
Monday, we moved to Monday. Okay, sorry.
Monday, that's the 8th.
Mhm.
Monday is the 8th. So yeah, okay. We'll
If
be
I'm
ready.
wrong, do check the schedule. Everything is on the
Okay.
Harriman website.
I'm
They do
sorry.
a better job with
I can be
remembering
behind.
dates than us.
Yeah, but you have 2 weeks to watch 4 series of Мертвые души and discuss it with us. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.